when desperate widow Grace McKenna offered herself as a wife to the ruthless debt collector threatening to seize her Kansas homestead in 1867, she believed her worth could only be measured by what others might accept. But a mysterious stranger's arrival on her drought-stricken prairie would soon reveal that the most dangerous thing she faced wasn't losing her land, it was discovering she had never truly known her own value. What happens when a woman who has learned to beg for survival meets a man who sees her strength before her desperation? The sound of breaking glass shattered the morning quiet, like a gunshot across the Kansas prairie. Grace McKenna dropped to her knees beside the scattered pieces of her mother's china teacup, the last pretty thing she owned in the whole world. Her hands shook as she picked up the biggest piece, seeing her tired face reflected in the broken porcelain. "Mama, don't cry." 7-year-old Benjamin wrapped his thin arms around her neck from behind, his breath warm against her ear. "It's just a cup." But it wasn't just a cup. Grace pressed her lips together to stop the tears that wanted to come. That teacup had traveled all the way from Pennsylvania in her mother's hope chest. It had survived the long wagon ride west when she married William. It had sat on their kitchen shelf through good times and bad, holding steam and comfort on cold mornings. Now it lay in pieces on the dirt floor of their tiny cabin, just like everything else in her life. 10-year-old Emma stood in the doorway, her pale yellow hair hanging loose around her shoulders. She clutched a piece of bread in her small fist, their breakfast, dinner, and probably tomorrow's meal all rolled into one. The child's blue eyes held too much understanding for someone so young. "The dust got in again," Emma said quietly, pointing to the fine brown powder that coated everything in their one-room home. No matter how tight Grace tried to seal the cracks in the walls, the Kansas wind always found a way inside. Grace stood up slowly, her knees creaking like old wood. At 28, she felt older than her grandmother had at 60. 3 months of worry and fear had carved lines around her eyes and stolen the softness from her cheeks. She smoothed her patched brown dress and tried to smile for her children. "The dust means wind," she said, forcing her voice to sound cheerful. "And wind means cooler weather might be coming." But even as she said it, Grace could feel the heat pressing against the cabin walls like a living thing. August in Kansas was brutal, and this year seemed worse than most. Their small vegetable garden was dying, despite her daily trips to the creek with buckets of water. The corn stalks stood brown and brittle in the field where William had planted them with such hope just months before the fever took him. Benjamin released her neck and skipped to the window, pressing his nose against the glass. "Mama, there's a man coming." Grace's heart jumped into her throat. She rushed to the window and peered over Benjamin's head, squinting against the bright sunlight. Far down the dusty trail that connected their homestead to the main road, she could see a dark figure on horseback, moving toward them. Visitors were rare out here on the edge of civilization. Most people had good reason to travel this far from town, and lately, those reasons hadn't been pleasant ones. Last month, the sheriff had come to tell the widow Hanson that her oldest boy had been killed in a saloon fight. 2 weeks ago, a banker had ridden out to foreclose on the Morrison farm. "Get away from the window," Grace whispered, pulling both children back. Her mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Bills, collectors, government men, outlaws looking for easy targets. She hurried to the wooden chest beside her bed and pulled out William's old rifle. Her hands remembered the weight of it, though she hadn't fired a gun since he died. William had taught her to shoot rabbits for the pot, but he'd never expected her to defend their home alone. "Mama?" Emma's voice was very small. "It's all right, sweetheart." Grace checked to make sure the rifle was loaded, trying to keep her movements calm and steady, just being careful. Through the thin walls, she could hear the rhythmic thud of horse hooves getting closer. The rider was taking his time, not rushing like someone with urgent news or bad intentions. That was something, at least. Grace positioned herself beside the window, where she could see out without being seen. The children huddled together on the bed, Emma's protective arm around Benjamin's shoulders. They'd learned not to ask too many questions when their mother got scared. The horseman came into clear view as he crested the small hill that marked the boundary of their property. He was tall and thin, dressed in a black suit despite the heat. His horse was well fed and groomed, which meant he had money. His posture was straight and formal, like a preacher or a government official. Grace's stomach twisted into knots. Men in fancy clothes never brought good news to poor folks. The rider stopped at their fence line and dismounted with careful, precise movements. He tied his horse to the fence post and removed his black hat, revealing thinning hair and a narrow face. Even from a distance, Grace could see that his eyes were cold and calculating as they swept over their small homestead. He walked to their front door with the confident stride of a man who owned the ground he walked on. When his knuckles rapped against the wooden door, the sound was sharp and demanding. "Mrs. McKenna? I know you're in there." Grace's breath caught. He knew her name. This wasn't a random visitor or a mistake. Whatever he wanted, he'd come here specifically for her. She set the rifle against the wall and opened the door just wide enough to see his face. "Yes?" "Ma'am." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that seemed polite but felt mocking. "My name is Jeremiah Colt. I represent the Topeka Land Company." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. The land company, the loan, the money they owed and couldn't pay. She'd been hoping against hope that they might have more time, that somehow the debt might be forgotten in the chaos of running a business so far from town. "Mr. Colt," she kept her voice steady with great effort. "I wasn't expecting you." "I'm sure you weren't." His thin lips curved in what might have been a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "May I come in? We have business to discuss." Grace glanced back at her children, who were watching with wide, frightened eyes. The last thing she wanted was to let this cold-eyed stranger into their home, but she didn't see any choice. Refusing him would only make things worse. "Of course." She stepped back and opened the door wider. Colt entered their small cabin with the air of a man inspecting livestock. His gaze moved from the dirt floor to the patched walls to the children huddled on the bed. Grace saw him take note of the broken teacup she hadn't had time to clean up, the thin layer of dust on everything, the smell of poverty that clung to places where people struggled to survive. "Cozy," he said, and the word sounded like an insult. Grace gestured to their single wooden chair. "Please, sit down." "Thank you." Colt settled himself in the chair and opened a leather case he'd been carrying. "Now then, Mrs. McKenna, I believe you know why I'm here." Grace remained standing, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "The loan." "Indeed." He pulled out a sheet of paper and studied it with theatrical attention. "Your late husband borrowed against this property 6 months ago. The original amount was $35, but with interest and fees, the debt now stands at $47.32. $47. It might as well have been $400. Grace had less than $3 hidden in a tin can under the floorboards, saved penny by penny from selling eggs to neighbors. Even if she sold everything they owned, she couldn't raise that kind of money. The payment was due. Colt made a show of consulting the paper again. "Last month." "I know." Grace's voice came out as barely a whisper. "My husband died of the fever. I haven't been able to." "Yes, I heard about William's passing." Colt's tone suggested that death was merely an inconvenience in business matters. "My condolences. However, death doesn't cancel debts, I'm afraid." Behind Grace, Benjamin made a small, scared sound. She turned to see both children staring at the stranger with the instinctive fear that small creatures feel when predators enter their territory. "What are my options?" Grace asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Colt folded the paper and returned it to his case with methodical precision. "Pay the debt in full, or vacate the property. I'm prepared to be generous and give you 2 weeks to make arrangements." 2 weeks. Grace felt the room spinning around her. Where could they go? What could they do? She had no family left back east, no money for train tickets even if she did. Her children would end up in an orphanage, separated and lost in a system that cared nothing for keeping families together. "Please." The word escaped her lips before she could stop it. "There must be something." Colt stood up, brushing imaginary dust from his black suit. "Business is business, Mrs. McKenna. I don't make the rules." But as he moved toward the door, Grace saw something change in his expression. His cold eyes traveled from her face down to her body and back up again, lingering in places that made her skin crawl. When he smiled this time, it was the look of a man who just thought of something interesting. Although, He paused with his hand on the door handle. I suppose there might be other arrangements we could discuss. Grace's blood turned to ice. She knew that look, had seen it in the eyes of men who thought widows were desperate enough to accept any offer, no matter how degrading. I don't understand, she lied. Don't you? Colt stepped closer, and Grace caught the smell of tobacco and something else. Something sour and unpleasant. A woman in your situation needs protection. A man like me needs companionship. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope ready to snap. Grace could hear her children breathing behind her, could feel their innocence hanging in the balance of whatever happened next. My children are well behaved, she heard herself saying, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. I can cook, clean, mend clothes. I can be a good wife to you, sir, if you'll consider taking us on instead of. She couldn't finish the sentence. The words stuck in her throat like broken glass. Colt's laugh was sharp and cruel. Mrs. McKenna, you misunderstand my position. I'm not in the market for a wife and a ready-made family. I'm here to collect debts, not acquire charity cases. The rejection hit Grace like a slap across the face. Even her desperate offer of herself wasn't enough. She wasn't worth $47 to anyone. I see. She straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, trying to salvage what remained of her dignity. Then I suppose we have nothing more to discuss. 2 weeks, Colt repeated as he opened the door. Find the money, or find somewhere else to call home. He walked out into the blazing afternoon sun, leaving Grace and her children alone with the echo of his words and the weight of impossible choices. Grace closed the door and leaned against it, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. Mama? Emma's voice was very quiet. What's going to happen to us? Grace looked at her daughter's frightened face, at Benjamin's wide eyes, full of questions he was too young to ask. She wanted to tell them everything would be all right, that she would find a way to save their home and keep their family together, but the lies wouldn't come. Instead, she pulled both children into her arms and held them tight against her chest, feeling their small hearts beating like trapped birds. Outside, she could hear Colt riding away, taking their future with him. 2 weeks. Somehow, she had to find a miracle in 2 weeks. The creek water was so low that Grace had to lie flat on her stomach to fill the bucket, pressing her face close to the muddy bank, where a thin trickle still flowed between the rocks. The August sun beat down on her back like a hammer, soaking her dress with sweat and making her head spin with the heat. She'd been coming here every morning for weeks, carrying water back to their dying garden in buckets that seemed to get heavier with each trip. The vegetables they'd planted with such hope in the spring were withering despite her efforts. The tomato plants hung limp and brown, their fruit shriveled before it could ripen. The bean plants had given up entirely, their leaves curled and brittle as old paper. Grace pushed herself up from the creek bank and lifted the bucket, feeling the muscles in her back protest. The water was barely enough to wet the ground around the potato plants, but it was better than nothing. Everything in their lives had come down to making the best of nothing. As she walked back toward the cabin, bucket in hand, Grace tried not to think about Jeremiah Colt's cold smile and the 2 weeks that were slipping away like water through her fingers. She'd spent the past 3 days walking to every farm within 10 miles, begging for work, offering to clean houses or help with harvest or anything that might earn a few coins. The answer was always the same. Times were hard for everyone. The drought had hurt every farmer in the county. Nobody had extra money to pay for help they could barely afford themselves. Mrs. Patterson at the general store had been kind but firm. I'd love to help you, Grace, but I can't even pay my own bills. Half the folks in town owe me money they don't have. Mr. Henderson, who owned the largest spread in the area, had been less gentle. I got 3 sons and a hired man. What would I need with a woman who's got children hanging on her skirts? The worst had been visiting the preacher, hoping the church might offer some assistance. Reverend Morrison had listened to her story with what seemed like sympathy, then suggested that perhaps God was testing her faith by putting obstacles in her path. Sometimes the Lord closes one door to open another. He'd said, his soft hands folded piously in his lap, perhaps it's time to consider that your children might be better off in the care of families who can provide for them properly. Grace had left the church feeling like she'd been kicked by a horse. Even the preacher thought she was a failure as a mother. Now, as she approached their cabin with her bucket of creek water, Grace saw Emma sitting on the front step with her doll clutched tightly in her arms. The doll was a poor thing, made from scraps of cloth and corn husks, but Emma treasured it, like other children might treasure store-bought toys. "Mama, Benjamin's feeling sick again," Emma said as Grace climbed the steps. Grace set down the water bucket and felt her heart clench with worry. What kind of sick? His stomach hurts, and he says he's dizzy. Grace hurried inside to find Benjamin curled up on their bed, his face pale and his forehead damp with sweat. When she pressed her hand to his skin, he felt warm but not feverish. She'd seen this before in the children of other poor families. It wasn't sickness. It was hunger. They'd been stretching their meager food supplies as far as possible, eating one small meal a day and trying to convince themselves they weren't really hungry, just saving their appetites. But growing children couldn't survive on hope and determination. "I'm not hungry, Mama," Benjamin said weakly, but his stomach growled loudly enough to contradict his words. Grace sat on the edge of the bed and smoothed his dark hair back from his forehead. "I know, sweetheart. Just rest for a while." She looked around their tiny cabin, taking inventory of their possessions with desperate eyes. William's tools were already sold. Her mother's jewelry, what little there had been, was gone too. The only things left were the furniture, their clothes, and a few household items that might bring $1 or $2 in town. The trunk at the foot of their bed contained her wedding dress, carefully wrapped in tissue paper. It was beautiful once. White silk with tiny pearl buttons and lace trim that had cost more than Grace had ever spent on anything in her life. William had been so proud to see her wear it on their wedding day. Maybe someone in town would want it for their own daughter's wedding. It wouldn't bring much money, but it might buy enough food to keep the children strong for a few more days. Grace was reaching for the trunk when she heard horse hooves outside. Her heart jumped with hope and fear. Maybe it was someone with work to offer. Maybe it was Colt coming back early. Maybe it was news, good or bad. She went to the window and peered out carefully. A rider was approaching, but this one was different from Colt. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in the saddle, and his clothes were practical rather than fancy. Leather vest, worn boots, a hat that had seen many seasons under the sun. As he drew closer, Grace could see that he was older than Colt, probably in his 40s, with weathered skin that spoke of years spent outdoors. His horse was a sturdy chestnut mare, well cared for but not showy. Everything about him suggested competence and reliability. He stopped at their fence line and dismounted with fluid movements. Unlike Colt, who had marched up to their door like he owned the place, this stranger waited by the fence as if asking permission to approach. "Ma'am?" His voice carried clearly across the yard. "I don't mean to disturb you, but I noticed your well looks to be running dry." Grace opened the door and stepped onto the porch, keeping her children behind her. "It's been a hard summer, Mr. Hartwell. Daniel Hartwell." He touched the brim of his hat politely. "I was passing through and couldn't help but notice. I've got some experience with wells, if you'd be amenable to the help." Grace stared at him, sure she'd misunderstood. "You're offering to help with our well?" "Yes, ma'am. No payment expected." The words were so unexpected that Grace almost laughed. After days of rejection and closed doors, here was a complete stranger, offering exactly what they needed most. It seemed too good to be true, which meant it probably was. "Why?" she asked suspiciously. Daniel Hartwell shifted his weight, looking almost embarrassed. "Well, I reckon it's because I was raised to believe that water shouldn't be a luxury, especially for families with children." Emma peeked around Grace's skirts, studying the stranger with bold curiosity. "Are you really going to help, Mama?" Daniel's weathered face broke into a genuine smile. "If she'll have me, little miss." Grace felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of tension she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. When was the last time someone had offered help without wanting something in return? When had anyone looked at her family and seen people worth helping instead of problems to be managed? She hesitated, afraid to accept in case this was some kind of cruel joke. We don't have money to pay you. Didn't ask for any. Daniel gestured toward the well with one weathered hand. Mind if I take a look? Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. She watched as Daniel walked over to their well and peered down into the depths, his expression thoughtful and professional. He tested the rope and pulley system, examined the stone walls, and knelt to study the ground around the base. Your husband dig this well? He called over. Yes, sir. 3 years ago when we first came here. Daniel nodded and continued his examination. Grace found herself studying him as he worked, noting the careful way he moved, the competent set of his shoulders, the patient thoroughness of his inspection. There was something deeply reassuring about watching a man who clearly knew what he was doing. The good news is your well's not dry, Daniel said, straightening up. The bad news is your pump mechanism's failing, and the water table's dropped some with the drought. But both of those problems have solutions. What kind of solutions? Grace asked, hardly daring to hope. Well, I can rebuild your pump system with some materials I've got in my pack. As for the water table, sometimes digging just a few feet deeper is all it takes to reach the flow again. Grace stared at him. You would do that? For strangers? Daniel's expression grew serious. Ma'am, I've been traveling this territory for nigh on 5 years now. I've seen what happens to families when the water runs out. It's not something I care to see happen again if I can prevent it. Behind Grace, Benjamin appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of conversation. He leaned against the door frame, still pale but curious about the stranger who'd come to help. How long would it take? Grace asked. Day and a half, maybe 2 days if the digging proves difficult. Daniel glanced at the sky, where clouds were beginning to gather despite the heat. Might be best to start soon, though. Looks like weather could be moving in. As if summoned by his words, a gust of wind swept across the prairie, carrying the scent of rain and distant thunder. Grace felt the first stirring of hope she'd experienced since Colt's visit. Water meant their garden might survive. It meant they could stay a little longer, fight a little harder. Mr. Hartwell, she said carefully, if you're serious about this offer, I accept it gratefully. Then I'll get started. Daniel walked back to his horse and began unpacking tools from his saddlebags. Might want to get your children inside soon, though. This storm's going to be a big one. As if to prove his point, lightning flickered in the distance, followed by a low rumble of thunder. The wind was picking up, bending the prairie grass and sending dust devils dancing across the yard. Grace herded Emma and Benjamin inside, but she couldn't resist watching through the window as Daniel Hartwell began working on their well. He moved with the steady efficiency of a man who'd done this work many times before, his hands sure and confident as he dismantled the broken pump mechanism. For the first time in weeks, Grace allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they weren't completely alone in the world. Maybe there were still people who helped because it was the right thing to do, not because they wanted something in return. Outside, the wind grew stronger and the sky darker. But inside their small cabin, Grace felt something she'd almost forgotten how to feel: hope. The hammer rang against metal like a church bell, calling people to prayer, each strike echoing across the empty prairie as Daniel Hartwell worked to save their dying well. Grace stood at her kitchen window, watching his steady movements, while she kneaded bread dough that was more water than flour, stretching their last cup of grain as far as it would go. Mama, why is that man helping us? Benjamin asked from his spot at the table, where he was drawing pictures in the dust with his finger. Grace paused in her kneading, considering how to explain kindness to a child who had seen so little of it lately. Some people help because it's the right thing to do, sweetheart. But why us? Emma joined the conversation from the corner where she was mending a tear in her dress with careful, tiny stitches that Grace had taught her. We don't have anything to give him. The question cut deeper than Grace expected. Why them, indeed? What had they done to deserve this stranger's generosity when their own neighbors had turned them away? She watched Daniel through the window, noting how he worked without hurry or complaint despite the growing heat of the day. Maybe, Grace said slowly, he knows what it feels like to need help. Outside, Daniel had removed his leather vest and rolled up his sleeves, revealing arms marked with old scars and the kind of muscle that came from years of hard work. He moved around their well like a man who understood machinery, taking apart the broken pump piece by piece and laying each component on a clean cloth with methodical care. Grace found herself studying his face as he worked, trying to read the story, written in the lines around his eyes, and the careful way he handled each tool. There was something about him that reminded her of William, not in looks, for Daniel was taller and darker, but in the quiet confidence of a man comfortable with his own hands and the problems they could solve. A sound from outside made her look up sharply. Hoofbeats again, coming fast this time. Grace's stomach clenched with familiar dread as she recognized the urgent rhythm of a rider pushing his horse hard across the prairie. Daniel heard it too. He straightened from his work and turned toward the sound, one hand moving instinctively to rest on something at his hip, a gesture so quick Grace almost missed it. The rider who appeared over the hill was young, maybe 17 or 18, with the kind of desperate energy that meant trouble. His horse was lathered with sweat and foam, and the boy himself looked like he'd been riding hard for hours. "Mr. Hartwell," the boy called out while still 50 yards away. "Mr. Hartwell, you got to come quick." Daniel dropped his tools and strode toward the fence line, his entire posture changing from relaxed competence to alert readiness. "What is it, Tommy?" "It's the Brennan place, sir." The boy, Tommy, pulled his horse to a sliding stop at their gate. "Raiders hit them in the night, burned the barn, ran off the livestock. Old man Brennan's hurt bad, and his wife's beside herself with worry." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. Raiders. The word struck fear into every settler's heart. Sometimes they were Confederate holdouts, still fighting a war that had ended 2 years ago. Sometimes they were just outlaws taking advantage of isolated farms. Either way, they meant violence and destruction. "How many?" Daniel's voice was crisp and professional, like a man accustomed to receiving bad news and acting on it. "4, maybe 5 from the tracks. They headed north toward the Badlands after they finished their business." Daniel nodded grimly. "Anyone else hurt besides Mr. Brennan?" "No, sir. But they're all scared. Mrs. Brennan asked me to find you special. Said you'd know what to do." Grace watched this exchange with growing confusion. Why would strangers send for Daniel Hartwell? What was his connection to these people she'd never heard of? And why did he seem so comfortable taking charge of a crisis involving raiders and violence? "Tell Mrs. Brennan I'll be there within the hour," Daniel said to Tommy, "and ride to the Henderson place on your way back. Tell them what happened and ask them to spread the word. Everyone needs to know there's trouble in the area." "Yes, sir." Tommy wheeled his horse around and galloped off, leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the still air. Daniel stood watching the boy disappear, his expression grim and thoughtful. When he turned back toward Grace, she saw something new in his weathered features, a hardness that hadn't been there while he worked on their well. "Ma'am," he said, walking back toward the cabin, "I'm afraid I need to cut my work short today. There's trouble that needs tending to." Grace stepped out onto the porch, her children clustering behind her like chicks seeking shelter. "The raiders, will they come here?" "Not likely. They usually hit and run, don't stick around to cause more trouble." But Daniel's tone suggested he wasn't entirely certain. "Still, it might be wise to keep your doors locked tonight and have your husband's rifle close to hand." "My rifle," Grace corrected quietly. Daniel paused in gathering his tools, and she saw understanding dawn in his eyes. Of course, he'd known she was a widow from the start, but somehow the reality of her situation seemed to hit him anew. "Your rifle," he agreed. "Do you know how to use it?" "William taught me to hunt rabbits." Grace tried to keep her voice steady. "I suppose the principle's the same for other things." A ghost of a smile crossed Daniel's face. "I suppose it is, ma'am." He finished packing his tools quickly, but Grace noticed he kept glancing at their cabin, and the children with an expression she couldn't quite read. Concern, maybe, or calculation. "Mr. Hartwell," she said as he prepared to mount his horse, "will you be coming back to finish the well?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with meanings neither of them wanted to speak aloud. Would he come back? Did she want him to? What did it mean that his leaving made her feel more alone than she had since William died? "If you'll have me, ma'am." soon as I can manage it." Daniel swung up into his saddle with fluid grace, then looked down at Grace and her children standing on their small porch. Something passed across his face, an emotion too quick to identify but deep enough to matter. "Mrs. McKenna," he said, his voice carrying a weight of unspoken concern. "If anything unusual happens, riders, strangers, anything that doesn't feel right, you pack up those children and head for town as fast as you can. Don't try to be brave. Don't try to protect property. Just go." The warning sent ice through Grace's veins. "You think they might come here?" "I think it's better to be careful than sorry." Daniel gathered his reins, his horse dancing impatiently beneath him. "Keep that rifle loaded, and trust your instincts." He rode away at a gallop, leaving Grace standing on her porch with more questions than answers. Who was this man who fixed wells, but also responded to raids? Why did strangers send for him in times of trouble? And why did his departure leave her feeling like she'd lost something important before she'd even understood what it was? "Mama?" Emma tugged at her skirt. "Are the bad men going to come hurt us?" Grace looked down at her daughter's worried face, then at Benjamin's wide eyes full of fear he was too young to understand. She thought about raiders and violence, about being alone on the prairie with no one to help if trouble came calling. But she also thought about Daniel Hartwell's steady hands working on their well, his patient kindness with her children, his promise to return. For reasons she couldn't explain, she believed he would keep that promise. "No, sweetheart," she said, pulling both children close. "We're going to be just fine." As the afternoon wore on, Grace found herself returning to the window again and again, watching the horizon for signs of danger or hope. She wasn't sure which anymore. The well sat half-repaired in their yard, a testament to interrupted kindness and the uncertain nature of everything in their lives. When evening came, she loaded William's rifle and set it beside her bed, just as Daniel had suggested. But as she lay listening to the night sounds of the prairie, Grace found herself thinking less about raiders and more about the mysterious man who had ridden into their lives like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known how to pray. Who was Daniel Hartwell, really? And why did the thought of never seeing him again make her chest ache with something that felt dangerously close to hope? Blood and thunder arrived together at dawn, painting the sky the color of violence while Daniel Hartwell's hammer sang its steady song against the morning air. Grace pressed her face to the window, watching him work on their well as if nothing had changed, as if yesterday's talk of raiders and danger had been nothing more than a bad dream. But the rifle still leaned against her bedroom wall, and her children still asked nervous questions about bad men and burning barns. "Did he catch the outlaws, Mama?" Benjamin wanted to know as he nibbled at their breakfast of thin porridge and hope. "I don't know, sweetheart." Grace continued watching Daniel through the glass, noting the tense set of his shoulders and the way his eyes kept scanning the horizon between hammer blows. "He doesn't look like a man who caught anyone." Emma joined her at the window, standing on tiptoe to see over the sill. "He looks tired." She was right. Even from a distance, Grace could see exhaustion in every line of Daniel's body. He'd been gone 2 days, and whatever he'd found at the Brennan place had left marks on him that went deeper than simple weariness. "Maybe we should take him some coffee," Emma suggested with the generous spirit of childhood. Grace hesitated. Part of her wanted to maintain the careful distance of formal gratitude. He was helping them, but that didn't make them friends. Another part, though, remembered the genuine kindness in his eyes when he'd first offered assistance, and the protective concern in his voice when he'd warned her about raiders. That's a thoughtful idea, she decided. Grace poured their precious coffee, real coffee, not the chicory substitute they usually drank, into William's old tin cup and carried it outside. The morning air was crisp with the promise of another scorching day, but for now it felt clean and hopeful. "Mr. Hartwell?" She approached the well carefully, not wanting to startle a man who seemed constantly alert for danger. "I thought you might like some coffee." Daniel looked up from his work, and Grace was startled by the shadows under his eyes and the grim set of his mouth. Whatever he'd seen at the Brennan place had shaken him badly. "That's mighty kind of you, ma'am." He accepted the cup gratefully and took a long drink, closing his eyes as if the warmth could wash away whatever memories he was carrying. "Was it very bad?" Grace asked quietly. Daniel's jaw tightened. Bad enough. They killed Mr. Brennan's milk cow just for meanness. Burned feed they couldn't steal. Broke things that couldn't be replaced. He paused, staring into the coffee cup. Worst part is, they'll probably be back. Raiders like that, they mark territory like wolves. Once they know, a place is easy pickings. He didn't finish the thought, but Grace understood. The Brennan place would be watched, and so would every other isolated farm in the area, including theirs. Did you find their trail? Lost it in the rocks about 10 miles north of here. Daniel's voice carried the frustration of a man accustomed to solving problems who'd met one he couldn't fix. Could be anywhere by now, or they could be holed up just over the next hill. The uncertainty was almost worse than knowing. Grace found herself scanning their small homestead with new eyes, seeing it as raiders might, isolated, defended only by a woman and 2 small children, ripe for whatever violence men might choose to inflict. Mr. Hartwell, she said carefully, when you've finished with our well, will you be moving on? The question seemed to catch him off guard. He looked up from his coffee, studying her face with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. That depends, ma'am, on whether you think it's wise for me to stay in the area given the circumstances. There was something in his tone that suggested layers of meaning Grace couldn't quite grasp. Was he asking about the raiders, or about something else entirely? I think, Grace said slowly, that having capable people nearby is always wise when there's trouble about. A smile ghosted across Daniel's weathered features. In that case, Mrs. McKenna, I believe I'll be sticking around these parts for a while. Before Grace could respond, the sound of approaching horses made them both freeze. Not one rider this time, but several, coming fast across the prairie with the urgent rhythm that meant either very good news or very bad trouble. Daniel set down his coffee cup and moved with fluid quickness to position himself between Grace and the approaching riders. The gesture was so natural, so instinctively protective, that Grace felt something shift in her understanding of this quiet man who fixed wells and responded to emergencies. Get inside, he said quietly. Take the children and get inside now. But Grace found herself rooted to the spot, watching the dust cloud resolve into 3 riders pushing their horses hard across the morning landscape. As they drew closer, she could make out their faces, grim, determined men with the look of trouble following close behind. The lead rider was a stranger, a big man with a salt and pepper beard and clothes that had seen better days. Behind him rode 2 younger men, and something in their formation suggested they weren't just traveling together, they were hunting something. Or someone. Hartwell, the bearded man called out, while still 50 yards away. Daniel Hartwell. Daniel stepped forward, his hand resting on his hip in that familiar gesture Grace had noticed before. That's me. What can I do for you, Sheriff? Sheriff. The word sent relief and confusion racing through Grace in equal measure. These weren't raiders, they were lawmen. But why were they looking for Daniel with such urgent intensity? The sheriff pulled his horse to a stop at their gate, his keen eyes taking in Daniel, Grace, and the domestic scene of well repair with swift evaluation. We need to talk, Daniel. Private-like. Daniel glanced back at Grace, and she saw something in his expression that made her stomach clench with sudden anxiety. Whatever this conversation was about, it wasn't going to be simple. Mrs. McKenna, Daniel said carefully, perhaps you should check on your children. This won't take long. Grace wanted to protest, wanted to demand answers to the dozens of questions swirling in her mind. Instead, she found herself nodding and walking toward the cabin on legs that felt unsteady as water. From inside, she pressed her ear to the door and caught fragments of urgent conversation carried on the morning breeze. Spotted them near Miller's Creek. At least 4, maybe more. Need to move fast before they hit another farm. Grace's blood turned to ice. The raiders. They were talking about the raiders, and somehow Daniel was involved in hunting them down. But that made no sense. He was just a man who fixed wells, wasn't he? The conversation outside grew more heated, voices rising and falling in the rhythm of disagreement. Grace caught Daniel's voice, firm and insistent. My responsibility too. And the sheriff's response, not your job anymore. But if you insist, not your job anymore. The words echoed in Grace's mind as she tried to piece together the puzzle of Daniel Hartwell. What job? What responsibility? Who was this man who'd walked into their lives with gentle hands and hidden depths? When the conversation finally ended, Grace heard the jingle of spurs and the creak of saddle leather as the lawmen prepared to ride out. She pressed her face to the window and watched them mount up, noting the grim determination on their faces and the way they checked their weapons before spurring their horses toward the northern horizon. Daniel stood watching them go, his shoulders tense with some internal struggle Grace couldn't begin to understand. When he finally turned back toward the cabin, she saw conflict written in every line of his weathered face. He walked to the door with slow, reluctant steps and knocked gently. "Mrs. McKenna, might I have a word?" Grace opened the door, her heart hammering with questions and fears she couldn't name. "Of course." Daniel removed his hat and held it in his hands, a gesture that seemed formal and somehow final. "Ma'am, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully." "All right. Those men who just rode out, they're tracking the same raiders who hit the Brennan place. There's reason to believe the outlaws are planning to strike again, maybe as soon as tonight." Grace felt the world tilt sideways. "Here? We don't know. Could be anywhere in the county. But ma'am," Daniel's voice grew heavy with something that sounded like regret, "I need to ride with them. It's complicated, but I have experience with this kind of situation, and they need all the help they can get." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. He was leaving. Again, just when she'd started to believe that maybe, possibly, they weren't completely alone in the world. "I understand," she said, proud that her voice came out steady. "Do you?" Daniel stepped closer, his gray eyes searching her face. "Because I need you to know, this isn't what I want. Given my choice, I'd stay right here and finish your well and make sure you and your children are safe. But you don't have a choice." "No, ma'am, I don't." Grace looked at this man who'd brought kindness and competence into their desperate situation, who'd made her children smile and given her hope for the first time in months. Now he was riding away to face danger she couldn't even imagine, and she might never see him again. "Be careful," she whispered. Daniel's expression softened. "I will. And Mrs. McKenna, that offer still stands. If anything feels wrong, anything at all, you take those children and head for town. Promise me." "I promise." He settled his hat on his head and walked toward his horse with the purposeful stride of a man heading into battle. As he swung up into the saddle, Grace found herself stepping forward, despite every instinct that told her to maintain proper distance. "Mr. Hartwell?" He looked down at her, waiting. "Come back," she said simply. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or gratitude, or something deeper that made her pulse quicken. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "I'll do my best." Then he was gone, riding hard to catch up with the sheriff and his men, leaving Grace alone with her children and a half-repaired well and the growing certainty that Daniel Hartwell was far more than he seemed, and that she cared about him in ways that scared her more than any raiders ever could. Gunshots cracked across the prairie like breaking bones, sharp and deadly in the pre-dawn darkness, as Grace McKenna jolted awake to the sound of violence coming closer. She pressed her hand to her racing heart and listened to the terrible symphony of men shouting, horses screaming, and weapons firing somewhere beyond the hills that bordered their small homestead. The battle had been raging for nearly an hour, distant enough to seem like someone else's nightmare, but close enough to rattle the windows of their cabin with each thunderous volley. Grace had been lying awake since the first shots rang out, clutching William's rifle and trying to convince herself that the sounds of war had nothing to do with them. But now, the gunfire was moving, getting closer, and with it came the wild whooping cries of men drunk on violence and the pounding of hooves that seemed to shake the very earth beneath their cabin. "Mama?" Emma's voice was small and frightened from the bed where she huddled with Benjamin, both children wide-eyed with terror they were too young to understand. "Hush, sweetheart." Grace crept to the window and peered through the gap in the curtains, her heart hammering so hard she could barely breathe. The eastern horizon was just beginning to show the first pale hints of dawn, but the landscape remained mostly dark, full of shadows that could hide any number of threats. A new sound cut through the chaos, the rapid drumbeat of a single horse approaching fast, its rider pushing the animal to its limits as he raced across the open ground toward their cabin. Grace raised the rifle to her shoulder, her hands shaking as she tried to remember everything William had taught her about shooting. The rider burst into view like something from a nightmare, bent low over his horse's neck, his clothes torn and bloodied, his face a mask of desperation and pain. For a heart-stopping moment, Grace didn't recognize him. Then the man raised his head, and she saw Daniel Hartwell's familiar features twisted with exhaustion and something that looked like defeat. "Daniel," she whispered, lowering the rifle. He pulled his horse to a sliding stop outside their cabin and half fell from the saddle, stumbling against the fence post as his legs nearly buckled beneath him. Blood soaked through his shirt at the shoulder, and his left arm hung at an awkward angle that made Grace's stomach clench with worry. "Mrs. McKenna," Daniel called hoarsely. "Are you there? Are you safe?" Grace threw open the door and ran toward him, her bare feet slapping against the cold ground. "Daniel, what happened? You're hurt." "Raiders," he gasped, leaning heavily against the fence. "We tracked them to Miller's Creek, but it was a trap. They were waiting for us. Sheriff's dead. So are the others." The words hit Grace like physical blows. Dead. All of them dead except Daniel, who stood swaying on his feet like a man pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. "How many raiders?" she asked, already dreading the answer. 6, maybe 7. They scattered after the fight, but some of them are heading this way. Daniel's eyes met hers, and she saw apology and fierce determination warring in their depths. "I tried to lead them away from you, but they're like wolves. They can smell weakness." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses drifted across the morning air. Not the panicked flight of a single rider this time, but the purposeful advance of men who knew exactly where they were going and what they planned to do when they got there. "How long do we have?" Grace asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Few minutes at most." Daniel tried to straighten, wincing as the movement sent fresh blood seeping through his shirt. "Mrs. McKenna, you need to get those children and run. Right now. Head for town and don't look back." "What about you?" Daniel's smile was grim and tired. "I'll buy you as much time as I can." Grace stared at this wounded man who was prepared to die for strangers and felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. She thought of her children cowering in the cabin, of the raiders coming to destroy everything they'd worked to build, of the choice between running and fighting. "No," she said quietly. "Ma'am?" "I said no." Grace's voice grew stronger with each word. "This is our home, our land. If you're going to make a stand, then we're going to make it together." Daniel's eyes widened. "Mrs. McKenna, you don't understand what you're saying. These men, they're not just outlaws. They're killers. They'll do things to you and your children that. Then we'd better make sure they don't get the chance." Grace turned toward the cabin, her mind racing through possibilities and plans. "Can you still shoot?" "With my right hand, yes." "Good, because I've got an idea." Grace ran back to the cabin, where Emma and Benjamin waited with the wide-eyed terror of children who understood that something terrible was coming but didn't know what to do about it. "Listen to me," Grace said, kneeling down to meet their frightened gazes. "We're going to play a game, but it's a very serious game with very important rules. Do you understand?" Both children nodded solemnly. "Emma, I need you to take Benjamin and hide in the root cellar. You remember where that is?" "Yes, Mama." "Good. Take the lantern, but don't light it unless you absolutely have to. Stay hidden until either Mr. Hartwell or I come to get you. If anyone else tries to open that door, anyone at all, you stay quiet as mice. Can you do that?" "What if the bad men find us?" Benjamin whispered. Grace pulled both children against her chest, breathing in the sweet smell of their hair and trying to memorize the feeling of their small bodies in her arms. "They won't find you, I promise." It was a promise she had no right to make, but sometimes hope was all a mother could offer her children. Grace helped Emma and Benjamin down into the small root cellar behind the cabin, a cramped space barely big enough for two small bodies, but well hidden beneath a wooden door covered with dirt and prairie grass. She kissed them both, whispered words of love that might be the last they ever heard from her, and closed the door on their frightened faces. When she returned to the front of the cabin, Daniel was examining William's old rifle with professional competence despite his wounded arm. "It's a good weapon," he said. "Accurate. Well maintained. Your husband knew his firearms." "He taught me to hunt rabbits," Grace said, accepting the rifle when Daniel handed it to her. "Rabbits don't shoot back," Daniel observed grimly. "No, but they're fast and smart and hard to catch." Grace checked the rifle's load with movements that were becoming steadier by the moment. "Sometimes. That's enough." The sound of approaching horses was closer now, accompanied by voices that carried clearly across the morning air. Rough voices, crude voices, the voices of men who had spent the night killing and were hungry for more violence. "How many rounds do you have?" Daniel asked. Grace counted quickly. 12. "I've got 8 left in my pistol, plus a few loose cartridges." Daniel positioned himself at the corner of the cabin, where he could see the approaching raiders while remaining partially hidden. "Mrs. McKenna, I need you to know something before this starts." "What?" "If this goes badly, if they get past us." Daniel's voice was steady, but his eyes were haunted. "Don't let them take you alive. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Grace looked at this wounded man who was prepared to die defending strangers and felt a fierce gratitude that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with recognition. She was looking at someone who understood that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were impossible. "I understand," she said quietly. The raiders appeared over the rise like demons emerging from hell itself. 5 men on horseback riding hard toward the cabin with weapons drawn and blood in their eyes. Grace caught glimpses of their faces in the growing dawn light. Bearded, dirty, marked with the kind of cruelty that came from men who had forgotten how to be human. "Remember," Daniel said softly, "make every shot count." The first raider was barely 50 yards away when Daniel's pistol cracked like thunder, and the man pitched backward from his saddle with a scream that was swallowed by the wind. The other 4 spread out, seeking cover and returning fire with rifles that sent splinters flying from the cabin walls. Grace aimed carefully at the nearest target, a thin man with wild hair who was trying to circle around behind them. She squeezed the trigger gently, just as William had taught her, and watched the man tumble from his horse with a cry of pain and rage. "Good shot," Daniel called, but his voice was strained with effort and pain. The remaining 3 raiders had taken cover behind a small rise in the ground, but Grace could see them moving, preparing for another assault. These weren't the desperate, disorganized men she had expected. They moved with the deadly precision of soldiers, coordinating their attack with hand signals and tactical awareness that spoke of military training. "Daniel," she said urgently, "who are these men?" "Confederate raiders," he replied grimly. "Deserters from the war who never learned how to stop fighting." As if to prove his point, one of the hidden men called out in a voice thick with southern accent, "You in the cabin. This don't have to end badly for everyone. Send out the woman and we'll make it quick and clean." Grace felt ice water flow through her veins. These men had no intention of letting any of them live, no matter what bargains they might offer. "What do you say we give them our answer?" Daniel asked, his voice grim with determination. Grace raised her rifle toward the sound of the voice and fired, the bullet sending up a spray of dirt near the raiders' hiding place. The message was clear enough. The battle for their lives had truly begun. The explosion of splintering wood and shattering glass filled the cabin as a rifle bullet punched through the window inches from Grace's head, showering her with fragments that cut her cheek and hands. She ducked low, pressing herself against the log wall, while her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. "They're trying to flush us out," Daniel called from his position near the door, blood from his shoulder wound spreading across his shirt in a dark stain that grew larger with each passing minute. Classic military tactic: pin us down, then move in from multiple directions. Grace wiped blood from her cheek and peered carefully around the edge of the broken window. The 3 remaining raiders had spread out in a wide semicircle, using whatever cover they could find to advance steadily toward the cabin. One had taken position behind their well, the same well Daniel had been working to repair when this nightmare began. Another crouched behind the overturned rain barrel near their garden. The third was crawling through the tall grass, getting closer with each moment that passed. "I can see two of them," Grace whispered. "Where's the third?" Daniel's answer came in the form of rapid gunfire from the back of the cabin, bullets thudding into the rear wall with the steady rhythm of a man who had plenty of ammunition and no intention of conserving it. "He's trying to get to the root cellar," Grace realized with a surge of terror so powerful it nearly paralyzed her. "No." Daniel struggled to his feet, his face pale but determined. "I won't let them hurt your children." Before Grace could protest, Daniel was moving toward the back door with the careful, deadly purpose of a man who had made his choice. She heard his boots cross the wooden floor, heard the creak of hinges as he opened the rear door, heard the sharp crack of his pistol as he engaged the raider who threatened her babies. The gunfight at the back of the cabin gave Grace a moment of opportunity. The two raiders she could see were focused on Daniel's position, temporarily forgetting about the woman with the rifle who crouched near the front window. She raised William's gun and took careful aim at the man behind their well. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and the raider spun sideways with a howl of pain and rage. Not a killing shot, but enough to send him scrambling for better cover while clutching his wounded arm. "You're gonna pay for that, woman," the injured raider shouted, his voice thick with pain and fury. "When we get our hands on you, we're gonna make you wish you'd never been born." Grace reloaded with hands that had stopped shaking, surprised by her own calmness in the face of such threats. Fear was still there, cold and sharp in her belly, but it was overlaid now with something fiercer and more primal. These men had come to destroy her family, her home, everything she had left in the world. They could threaten all they wanted, but she would make them pay dearly for every inch of ground they gained. The sound of fighting from the back of the cabin had stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that made Grace's blood run cold. Had Daniel been hurt? Killed? Was the third raider even now approaching the root cellar, where Emma and Benjamin huddled in terrified darkness? "Daniel," she called softly. No answer. Grace felt panic rising in her throat like bile. She had to know what was happening behind the cabin, had to make sure her children were safe. But leaving her position near the front window would expose her to the two raiders who were still out there, still waiting for exactly such an opportunity. The decision was made for her when one of the remaining raiders decided to make his move. She caught a glimpse of motion from the corner of her eye and turned to see a bearded man rushing toward the cabin from the direction of their garden, his rifle raised and ready to fire. Grace swung her own weapon around and pulled the trigger, but the shot went wide, sending up a spray of dirt beside the charging raider's feet. He stumbled but kept coming, his face twisted with savage determination. There was no time to reload. Grace grabbed the rifle by its barrel and prepared to use it as a club, knowing it was probably the last thing she would ever do but determined to make it count. The raider reached the cabin wall and started to climb through the broken window, his eyes wild with bloodlust and anticipated victory. That was when Daniel appeared behind him, like a ghost materializing from the morning shadows. Grace saw the flash of metal as Daniel's pistol came down hard against the raider's skull, dropping the man to the ground in an unconscious heap. "Are you hurt?" Daniel asked urgently, blood streaming from a fresh cut on his forehead. "No." "The children?" "Safe. The man trying to get to them won't be bothering anyone again." Grace felt a flood of relief so powerful it nearly buckled her knees. Her babies were safe. Daniel was alive. They had survived the first assault, but she could see in his grim expression that the fight was far from over. "How many left?" she asked. "Two that I can account for. Maybe more we haven't seen yet." As if summoned by his words, a new voice called out from somewhere beyond their fence line. Not the rough, crude tones of the raiders they'd been fighting, but something cultured and educated and infinitely more dangerous. "Mrs. McKenna, Mr. Hartwell, I believe we have matters to discuss." Grace and Daniel exchanged glances. This was no ordinary outlaw calling to them. This was someone accustomed to command, someone who expected to be obeyed. "What do you want?" Daniel called back. "Why, to conclude our business, of course. You've cost me several good men today, Mr. Hartwell. That's going to require compensation." There was something in the stranger's tone that made Grace's skin crawl. This wasn't about robbery or random violence. This was personal. directed specifically at Daniel. But why? What had he done to earn such focused hatred? "I don't know what you're talking about," Daniel replied, but Grace caught the slight tremor in his voice that suggested he knew exactly what the man meant. Laughter drifted across the morning air, cold and mocking. "Oh, but I think you do, Judge Hartwell. Or should I say, former Judge Hartwell. The man who sent my brother to hang for crimes he didn't commit?" Judge. The word hit Grace like a physical blow. Daniel was a judge, or had been one. That explains so many things. His air of authority, the way the sheriff had deferred to him, his knowledge of law and tactics and violence. But it also raised new questions that made her head spin with confusion and something that felt dangerously close to betrayal. Who was this man she had trusted with her children's lives? What other secrets was he hiding behind that weathered, competent exterior? "Your brother was guilty, Colt," Daniel called back. "The jury saw the evidence. Justice was served." Colt. Grace felt the world tilt sideways as pieces of a terrible puzzle began falling into place. Jeremiah Colt, the cold-eyed debt collector who had threatened to take their home. But this voice was different, cultured where Jeremiah's had been calculating. Brothers, perhaps, united in their hatred for the man who had brought justice down on their family. Justice? The cultured voice turned harsh with fury. "You call it justice when an innocent man dies because a corrupt judge needs to make an example. My brother Marcus never hurt anyone in his life." "Marcus Colt robbed 3 banks and killed 2 innocent people," Daniel replied firmly. "The evidence was overwhelming. The evidence was manufactured. You know it, I know it, and now you're going to pay for it." Grace found herself caught between 2 versions of truth, unable to know which man was lying and which was telling the truth. All she knew for certain was that her family had been drawn into a web of violence and revenge that had nothing to do with them and everything to do with the mysterious past of the man she had trusted. "Daniel," she whispered urgently, "is it true? What he's saying about you being a judge?" Daniel met her eyes, and she saw pain there that went deeper than his physical wounds. "Yes, I was a territorial judge for 5 years. I resigned after." He paused, struggling with memories that clearly haunted him. "After I realized I couldn't tell the difference anymore between justice and revenge." Before Grace could respond, the cultured voice called out again, closer now and filled with deadly promise. "I'm going to give you one chance, Hartwell. Come out with your hands up, and I'll make your death quick. Stay in there, and I'll burn that cabin down around your ears. Either way, you're going to pay for what you did to my family." Grace looked at this wounded man who had hidden his true identity, who had brought danger to her doorstep through his past actions, who now faced a choice between surrender and a fight they probably couldn't win. She also looked at the man who had fixed her well without payment, who had protected her children at risk to his own life, who had stood between her family and violence with nothing but courage and determination. Whatever Daniel Hartwell had been, whatever mistakes he might have made, Grace knew what he was now. The only thing standing between her children and the kind of men who burned homes and murdered families for the sake of revenge. "We fight," she said quietly. Daniel stared at her. "Mrs. McKenna, you don't understand what you're getting into. This isn't your battle. It became my battle the moment they threatened my children." Grace checked her rifle and moved to the window, her resolve hardening like steel in a forge. "Besides, you helped fix our well. Seems only fair we help you finish what you started." For the first time since the violence began, Daniel Hartwell smiled. It was a tired, bloody, grateful smile that transformed his weathered features and made Grace understand why she had trusted him from the very beginning. Outside, she could hear movement as their enemies prepared for the final assault. But inside the cabin, a widow and a wounded judge prepared to make their stand together, bound by something stronger than shared danger and deeper than gratitude. They were bound by the simple, fierce determination to protect what mattered most, whatever the cost might be. Fire licked at the cabin walls like hungry tongues as smoke began seeping through the gaps in the logs, filling their small sanctuary with the acrid smell of burning wood and impending doom. Grace pressed a damp cloth to her mouth and tried not to think about Emma and Benjamin trapped in the root cellar, while flames crept closer to everything they'd ever called home. "They're not just trying to smoke us out," Daniel said grimly, watching orange light dance across the windows. "They mean to burn us alive." Through the thickening smoke, Grace could hear the educated voice of the man called Colt, shouting orders to his remaining companion. "Keep feeding the fire! Don't let them escape through the back!" The heat was becoming unbearable, and Grace knew they had minutes at most before the cabin became their funeral pyre. But stepping outside meant walking into the guns of men who had already proven they took pleasure in killing. "There has to be another way," Grace whispered, her eyes watering from the smoke. Daniel reloaded his pistol with careful movements despite his wounded shoulder. "Ma'am, I need to tell you something before this ends. About the man I used to be. About why this is happening. Daniel, we don't have time for..." "Please." His voice carried the weight of a confession he'd been carrying too long. Marcus Colt wasn't just any outlaw. He was part of a gang that terrorized homesteaders like you. Families with children. I saw what they did to innocent people, and when he came before my court, I made sure justice was swift and final. Grace studied his face through the smoke, seeing pain that went deeper than physical wounds. "You think you made a mistake?" "I think I became the kind of man who saw enemies everywhere, and forgot that mercy was part of justice too." Daniel met her eyes. "But I've never regretted protecting families like yours." The sound of splintering wood made them both turn toward the back of the cabin, where flames were beginning to eat through the rear wall. The fire was spreading faster than Grace had expected, fed by the dry Kansas wind and months of drought. "The children!" Grace gasped, realizing that smoke would soon fill the root cellar where Emma and Benjamin waited in terrified darkness. Without thinking, she ran toward the back door, but Daniel caught her arm with his good hand. "It's what they're waiting for. The moment we step outside, they'll cut us down." "Then, what do you suggest?" Grace demanded, fear for her children overriding every other consideration. Daniel was quiet for a moment, his weathered face thoughtful despite the chaos around them. Then his expression changed, hardening into something that reminded Grace of the judge he used to be. "We give them what they want," he said quietly. "What?" "They want me. They want justice, or their version of it. So I'm going to walk out that front door and face them directly." Grace stared at him in horror. "That's suicide." "Maybe, but it'll draw their attention away from you and the children. While they're focused on me, you can get Emma and Benjamin out of the cellar and run for town." "No," the word came out flat and final. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself for us." "Mrs. McKenna." "Grace." She looked at this man who was prepared to die for strangers, and felt something shift in her chest, something warm and fierce and completely unexpected. "My name is Grace." And I said no. Before Daniel could argue further, a new sound cut through the crackle of flames and the shouts of their enemies. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses approaching fast from the direction of town, accompanied by voices calling out in organized formation. "That's the town militia," Daniel said, hope flickering in his eyes. Someone must have seen the smoke. The cultured voice of their enemy turned sharp with alarm. "Riders coming! Finish this now!" Grace heard running footsteps as the remaining raiders moved to execute whatever final plan they had in mind. Through the smoke-hazed window, she caught glimpses of movement as armed men positioned themselves for one last assault on the burning cabin. "They're not going to wait for the militia," Daniel said urgently. "They're coming now." The front door exploded inward, under the impact of a heavy boot, and Grace found herself face to face with a man who looked like an older, more refined version of Jeremiah Colt. This was clearly the educated brother, the one who spoke of justice and revenge with equal conviction. He was tall and well-dressed, despite the violence of the morning, with intelligent eyes that burned with the kind of hatred that came from years of careful nurturing. In his hand was a pistol pointed directly at Daniel's chest. "Judge Daniel Hartwell," the man said with grim satisfaction. "We meet at last. Thomas Colt, I presume." Daniel stepped forward, placing himself between Grace and the gun. "You've gone to a lot of trouble for revenge." "Justice," Thomas corrected. "The justice you denied my brother. Your brother was a killer and a thief. He got exactly what he deserved." Thomas's face twisted with rage. Marcus was trying to feed his family after the war destroyed everything we had. You turned him into a criminal with your harsh judgments and impossible fines." Grace listened to this exchange with growing understanding. This wasn't just about one man's guilt or innocence. This was about the aftermath of a war that had left families broken and desperate, about men who had chosen different paths through the wreckage of their old lives. "Put down the gun, Thomas," Daniel said quietly. "Your fight is with me, not with this woman and her children." "The woman stays to watch," Thomas replied coldly. "I want witnesses to see what happens to judges who forget that mercy is supposed to temper justice." The militia was closer now. Grace could hear their horses and voices growing louder as they approached the burning homestead. But would they arrive in time to prevent one final act of violence? Thomas Colt raised his pistol, his finger tightening on the trigger, with the deliberate motion of a man who had been planning this moment for months. Grace saw death in his eyes and knew that in seconds, Daniel would be lying on the floor of her burning cabin. That was when she did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She stepped between them. "Mrs. McKenna, no." Daniel reached for her, but Grace was already moving, placing her body between the gun and the man who had risked everything to protect her family. "You want to talk about justice?" Grace said to Thomas Colt, her voice steady despite the fear racing through her veins. "Then let's talk about it. This man came to our home as a stranger and fixed our well without payment. He protected my children from your raiders. He's bleeding from wounds he took defending people he barely knows." Thomas stared at her, clearly not expecting this interruption to his carefully planned revenge. "That's not justice or mercy," Grace continued. "That's just goodness. The kind of goodness that makes a person worth saving, worth fighting for. So if you want to shoot him, you'll have to shoot through me first." For a moment, the only sounds were the crackle of flames and the approaching thunder of horses. Thomas Colt looked at this determined woman standing between him and his revenge, and something flickered in his educated features. "You don't understand," he said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "He destroyed my family. And now you want to destroy mine?" Grace shook her head. "When does it end, Mr. Colt? When everyone who ever hurt you is dead. When every family who ever stood up to you is burned out of their homes." The front yard erupted with the sound of horses and shouting men as the town militia finally arrived. Through the smoke and flames, Grace could see armed riders surrounding the cabin, their weapons drawn and ready. Thomas Colt looked around at the impossible odds now facing him, then back at Grace's determined face and Daniel's protective stance behind her. Whatever he saw there seemed to drain the fight out of him. "This isn't over," he said quietly, but the words carried the weight of defeat rather than threat. "Yes," Grace said firmly, "it is." Spring sunshine warmed Grace's face as she stood in her flourishing garden, watching Daniel teach Benjamin how to properly set fence posts, while Emma peppered him with questions about territorial law and the responsibilities of judges. 6 months had passed since the morning of fire and violence, 6 months of healing and building and learning to trust in the possibility of happiness. The cabin had been rebuilt, larger now and stronger, with help from neighbors who had come running when they saw the smoke. The well Daniel had started repairing was finished at last, producing clear, cold water that turned their garden into a green oasis on the prairie. But the most important changes weren't visible to the eye. Grace no longer jumped at the sound of approaching horses or kept William's rifle loaded beside her bed. The children laughed freely again, their nightmares fading into memory as the simple routines of daily life restored their sense of safety. And Grace herself had discovered something she thought she'd lost forever, the ability to hope for more than mere survival. "Mama," Emma called from where she sat on the porch steps, "Mr. Daniel says there's going to be a new school in town next year. Can we go?" "We'll see, sweetheart." Grace smiled at the enthusiasm in her daughter's voice. Education had been a luxury she'd thought they could never afford, but Daniel's appointment as the town's new magistrate came with a steady salary that made many things possible. Daniel approached across the yard, his left arm finally free of the sling he'd worn for months after the shoulder wound. His hair was shorter now, more befitting a man who held public office, but his eyes still held the same gentle competence that had first drawn Grace's trust. "The Henderson boy brought this from town," he said, holding out an official-looking envelope. "Letter from the territorial capital." Grace wiped her hands on her apron and accepted the envelope with curiosity. The return address showed it was from the Department of Justice, and the formal language inside made her frown with concentration. "What does it say?" Daniel asked gently. "It's about Thomas Colt. His sentence has been commuted to 10 years in the territorial prison instead of—" Grace looked up from the letter. "Instead of hanging. They're calling it an act of judicial mercy." Daniel nodded slowly. The territorial governor decided that Thomas was more a victim of circumstances than a true criminal. The war left a lot of men broken and bitter. Sometimes understanding is more powerful than punishment. Grace thought about the educated man who had burned their cabin and threatened their lives, remembering the pain in his eyes when he spoke of his dead brother. Justice and mercy were complicated things, harder to balance than she'd ever realized. "Do you think we made the right choice?" she asked, speaking for him at the trial. "I think," Daniel said carefully, "that we chose to break a cycle of violence rather than perpetuate it. Whether that's right or wrong, only time will tell." The sound of a buggy approaching made them both look toward the road, where Grace's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, was driving her weekly route between the scattered homesteads. She pulled up at their gate with a broad smile and a wave. "Grace, Daniel, I've got news from town that I thought you'd want to hear." "Good news, I hope," Grace called back. "The best kind. That young couple from Ohio, the ones who've been looking for land to homestead, they've decided to settle on the old Morrison place. Means we'll have new neighbors and maybe enough children for that school Emma's been talking about." Grace felt a warm glow of satisfaction. New families meant growth and community, the kind of connections that turned empty prairie into a real place to call home. After Mrs. Patterson had driven on with her news and gossip, Grace found herself standing quietly with Daniel in their yard, watching the sun sink toward the western horizon in a blaze of gold and crimson. The children were inside helping with supper, their voices mixing with the everyday sounds of a family settling into evening routines. "Daniel," Grace said softly, "do you ever regret giving up your circuit judgeship to settle here? Do you mean, do I miss the travel and the authority and the important cases?" Daniel considered the question seriously. "Sometimes. But then I watch Benjamin learn to read, or see Emma's face when she masters a new skill, or sit down to supper with people who've become my family." He paused, looking at Grace with an expression that made her heart skip in a way that was becoming familiar and welcome. "No," he continued quietly, "I don't regret it. This is exactly where I'm supposed to be." Grace felt the truth of those words settle into her bones like warmth from a good fire. She thought about the desperate woman who had offered herself to Jeremiah Colt in exchange for a few more weeks in their cabin, who had believed her worth could be measured by what others might accept. That woman seemed like a stranger now, replaced by someone who understood that worth wasn't something you begged for or bargained away. It was something you built, day by day, with choices and courage and the love you gave freely to people who mattered. "Grace," Daniel said, his voice carrying a note of nervous formality that made her look at him more closely. "Yes? I've been thinking about something for a while now, and I believe it's time I spoke plainly about it." He cleared his throat, suddenly looking as nervous as a schoolboy facing his first examination. "About us. About what we've become to each other." Grace felt her pulse quicken, but her voice remained steady. "What have we become, Daniel?" "Partners. Friends. People who've learned to depend on each other in ways that go beyond practical necessity." Daniel took a step closer, his gray eyes serious and warm. "Grace, I'd like very much to ask if you'd consider making our arrangement permanent, legal, if you'd do me the honor of becoming my wife." The proposal hung in the evening air between them, simple and honest, and completely free of the desperation that had colored every choice Grace had made for so long. This wasn't about survival or necessity or trading herself for security. This was about two people who had found something worth keeping in each other. "Daniel Hartwell," Grace said, letting a smile spread across her face. "I thought you'd never ask." When he kissed her, it tasted like hope and felt like coming home at last. Around them, The Kansas prairie stretched endless and beautiful under the setting sun, full of the promise of seasons to come and the quiet satisfaction of work well done. In the distance, a meadowlark called to its mate, and Grace thought how wonderful it was that even in the vast loneliness of the frontier, no one had to remain alone forever. Worth wasn't something you begged for from strangers or measured by society's harsh judgment. Worth was something you discovered in yourself, nurtured in the people you loved, and built together one day at a time with courage, kindness, and the simple determination to create something beautiful from whatever materials life provided. The wind carried the scent of growing things and the promise of tomorrow, and Grace McKenna Hartwell felt truly, completely, unshakably at home in her own skin at last.